This is the second lecture for the lecture on state building, and what I want to talk about is how England and Poland designed their governments. Before we go into the period which is our time period for the class, I want to give you sort of a quick and dirty history of English government. And what we just talked about in the previous lecture was absolutism, or the divine right of kings. This lecture I want to talk about something called a constitutional monarchy, where you have a balance of power between a monarch and a parliament. Just some early history of how this all developed. You've got William the Conqueror, who conquered England in 1066, and he brought over feudalism into England. And this started the whole process. In the 1200s, if you remember your world history too, you've got the Magna Carta being signed. And this started the movement that we might call human rights, but in particular, what the Magna Carta did is it took away quite a few rights from the king. And in the process of doing this, the English developed their parliament, or the talking. So a group of people, usually the wealthy, who got together, and they helped the king run the government. You've got a very famous queen called Elizabeth, and she played a big role in sort of the development of the parliament. You also have a queen called Mary, Queen of Scots. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is I want to bring you up to the time of King James. So James was her son. And if you've heard of the King James Bible, this is the King James that we're talking about. So now what I want to do in the rest of the lectures is talk about the development of the parliament and how the monarchs, at least in this early period, were fighting against the parliament, and what that did in terms of developing the English form of government. And we just talked about absolutism, the divine right of kings, and how in England you have a constitutional monarchy. Now, as you can imagine, not all the monarchs were interested in having a parliament. Two in particular were King James the First and Charles the First. So King James the First in particular did not like the fact that the parliament could control what he was doing, because he believed in the divine right of kings, just like his son believed in the divine right of kings. Other problems that were happening in England that helped sort of determine what type of government England had was on religion. So King James was a Protestant, and his wife was a Catholic. Now this caused some problems in the beginning, because a lot of the parliament, they were worried that you'd have a Catholic child. Now that didn't totally happen, but you've got a series of events happening in England, like the Catholics threatening the life of the king, that made King James really hate the Catholics. So you see a lot of Catholic persecution in England during this time. But more importantly, you've got King James fighting against the Parliament. Now, he ends up dying, and his son takes over, Charles I. Charles I really hated the Parliament. And he tried to rule England without the Parliament. So this time period happened for about 10 years. Now, one thing, if you remember your world history too, if you didn't have it, one of the things that the Parliament did is they authorized the raising of funds for an army. So this is what the kings really did not like. And you've got Charles trying to fight with Scotland and trying to fight with other countries, and he doesn't have the money to do it, so he has to go to Parliament to ask them. And a few times Parliament refused to do this. And this obviously did not make him happy. And ultimately what you have during this period is a civil war, where you've got Charles I and his troops fighting against the Parliament and their troops. And we'll talk about Cromwell, who was the leader of the Protestant rebellion in England, in the next slide. But this civil war led to Charles ruling the country again for a very long time without the Parliament. This war with the Parliament did not go very well for Charles I. In fact, he was defeated in battle. And what he tried to do is turn himself into the Scots, who he didn't really like. The Scottish people decided to send him back to the Parliament. So what he was done is put on trial for the charges of treason and murder, for all the things that were happening during this particular period. Charles, of course, being the king, said that the courts could not rule against him, or they couldn't even have any type of ruling with him. But the English courts did not find that argument very valid, and what they found him is guilty. Now, in the next slide, I will show you what happened to King Charles I. The English people decided to execute their king. So what they did was they beheaded him on a stage in London. And this is the first time that you've got the English people removing their king through the court system, and the first time that the people ended up killing their king. Now, I just mentioned Cromwell. So Cromwell was the leader of the Protestants, and he was a general. And essentially what he ended up doing is taking over England and turning it into his own sort of dictatorship. Now, Charles I had a son who, luckily for us, was named Charles II. Cromwell drove him out of Scotland, which is where Charles II ended up fleeing. And what he did is, when he came back to England after this particular battle, he declared that England was a republic. Now, eventually, Cromwell becomes a dictator. He calls himself Lord Protector, but he is in total control of what happens in England. He starts press censorship. Local officials were replaced by people who he liked, and it was a big, big problem, as you can guess. The English people weren't used to having a ruler like this, and they weren't really happy. Now, luckily for the English people, Cromwell dies in 1658. He has a son named Richard, and people were really worried that Richard would end up taking over his father's role. Luckily, Richard didn't want anything to do with this, and what happened is the English Parliament got together, and surprisingly enough, they invited Charles II back to rule England. And what they ended up doing is digging up Cromwell's corpse, hanging it in front of the public, so that this would be a good example for people in the future who do things like becoming a dictator of England. So you have Charles II becoming King of England. Now, he, now no big surprise, did not like the Parliament either. So there were some things that the king could do without the Parliament. So he could conduct foreign policy. He could choose his own ministers. He could call Parliament into session and then end it. And he could also override any of the legislation that the Parliament makes just by suspending it. Now, the Parliament, on the other hand, so you've got the king. He can choose his own ministers, but the Parliament can get rid of the ministers by impeaching them. And of course, I mentioned this earlier, the Parliament has a big role in raising taxes. So this is what makes up a constitutional monarchy. You've got the Parliament on one side and a king on the other. Now, Charles II was an Anglican, which is the Church of England. Religion was a little bit of a problem during this period because the Parliament in general did not want a Catholic coming into power. Now, Charles II had a whole bunch of children, but they weren't legitimate, so he had them with a bunch of women. People were worried about who was going to take over when Charles II died. And he had a brother named James. Now, James was a Catholic, so this caused a little bit of uproar in England. And you have two main political parties emerging during this period. You've got one called the Tories, and they wanted James to be the next king, even though he was Catholic, because they believed that the kingship was hereditary. You've got another group of people called the Whigs, and they wanted the king to be Protestant regardless of the hereditary rights. In the end, what happened is that the Tories end up winning this argument, and when Charles II died, his brother James became the King of England. Now, James was fairly tolerant, but the Parliament didn't like him. And so what they ended up doing is inviting his daughter to become queen by throwing out her father, James II. And this whole process of kicking out James II is called the Glorious Revolution. So Mary was married to William, and William and Mary decided to take the Parliament's offer. So they arrived in England, kicked James II out, who fled to France. Now, the deal between the Parliament and the new King and Queen of England is that they had to give up some of their rights. And I put a whole list of things here on the slide. So the crown wasn't hereditary. The monarchs could no longer suspend Parliament. And it also gave the English people the right to petition their government and so on. The King and Queen also issued something called the Act of Toleration, which gave toleration for both Catholics and Protestants, and in this case, the Anglican Church. Now, William and Mary were excited about this, even though the fact that they gave away a whole bunch of their rights. And the reason they were excited is because William decides to go to war with France. So now he had his home country, and he had the English troops beside him for fighting this big war. So even though the monarchs give away more of their rights, they were pretty happy with this. So we've looked at how absolutism affected the way that France in particular set up its government, and we just looked at how constitutional monarchy developed in England, which was a long struggle. The last one I just want to really briefly mention is what I've called a failed state, which is Poland. Now, Poland had lots of problems all throughout its entire history because it's surrounded by Russia on one side and the German states on the other, who all wanted a piece of Poland. But they did organize their government, but they did something really interesting where one person out of the entire parliament could suspend anything. This is called Liberum Veto. So as I put up here, allowed any member of parliament to suspend it. Now, of course, as you can imagine, this was not a good way to form a government because nothing ever got off the ground, because all it took is one person to veto an entire legislation. Then they had to go back, create new legislation, and if one person didn't like that, it was canceled, and so on. The last slide for this lecture is looking at an economic theory which is pretty popular during this period where you've got European governments forming. So mercantilism was popular with an absolutism type of government in France. It was also popular in a constitutional monarchy, such as in England. And I talked a little bit about mercantilism earlier, and here I just give you a list, and I'll pop a tag or two up, so if you're interested in learning more about mercantilism, you can certainly look that up. But in general, the idea is that you need to have a lot of gold and silver in your treasury. And this is the period when you've got these countries going out and forming colonies. And of course, colonies are one way to bring in a whole bunch of money. So this is all these sort of things that are happening are all tied together in terms of this economic theory of mercantilism. So you've got these colonies. These provide an instant market for the mother country. You have to have some way of protecting them. So it makes sense that one part of mercantilism is to have a strong navy, because many of these colonies were overseas. So France had its colonies in Canada and along the Mississippi. England had its colonies in North America. Spain had its colonies in Central and South America, and so on. Another part of mercantilism is having a strong agriculture. Now this makes sense. Most of the economies, in fact all the economies during this period, are based on having based on agriculture. Another important thing to have a strong country, according to mercantilism, is to make more than you can actually use. So in this case, the idea is that you export more, which makes you more money, than you import, which you bring in. And you can think of food in this example. So when a country creates food, hopefully they make enough for the people to eat and then have a bit of extra to sell. Now, if they don't do that, if they don't make enough food for its people to eat, they have to import food. And you can imagine that's a really bad position to be in, because then you're reliant on your allies who at any minute could become your enemies and cut off your food supply. So that's mercantilism. It was an economic theory fairly popular between about 1500, when you have the colonies beginning, and about 1800. And the economic theory that supersedes it is capitalism, which is developed by a man named Adam Smith. And we will look at that in a few weeks.